My name is Sam. I'm 28. For 10 years, I lived a lie, convinced I was my family's silent hero, sending every military paycheck to save my grandfather's struggling farm. Then, home from Kandahar that Christmas, my father threw me out. At his own dinner table, he called me a burden, dismissing a decade of sacrifice. My world imploded. Did I know the full truth? Not yet. But within hours at my grandfather's farm, the horrifying reality unspoolled. "What money?" he asked, pale. I never got a cent. My funds were gone. My father had also returned every letter, claiming I'd abandoned them. 10 years of my life, stolen, revealed in one brutal night. The man behind it all? He was likely home, comfortable, completely unaware his carefully built deception was about to crumble. Before I do, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story earns it. Drop your city and your local time in the comments. I like knowing who's out there. The house in Salem still smelled like cinnamon and floor polish, the way it had when I was 10 years old. My mother, Carol, took my coat without quite looking at me. My sister, Heather, had set out the good plates, the ones with the gold rims that came out twice a year. I'd brought gifts I couldn't really afford. A scarf for my mother, a die-cast truck for Heather's son, a bottle of decent wine. Old habit. When you've spent your whole life being the one who shows up carrying something, you forget how to walk through a door empty-handed. I leaned my cane against the wall where nobody would trip on it, and lowered myself into a chair. "You just sit," Heather said. "We'll bring things to you." She said it the way you'd talk to a guest who might break. It landed like a diagnosis. My brother Mark passed the rolls, and kept his eyes on his plate. 28 years old, and still flinching at his own father's silence. For 40 minutes we talked about the weather, the new bypass, and Heather's kitchen remodel. The quartz counters, the farmhouse sink. Nobody asked about Kandahar. Nobody asked about the leg. Which was fine, because I hadn't come for sympathy. But nobody mentioned the 10 years of paychecks either. 10 years of wiring almost everything I earned into the family account. Money my father swore was the only thing keeping his own father's beef farm out of foreclosure. I kept waiting for that subject to surface. The way you wait by a door you've already heard unlock from the other side. "So, how long are you planning to stay?" My mother asked halfway through the ham. It wasn't a welcome. It was a clock. And it had just started running. I told her I hadn't planned that far. The medical discharge had only finalized 3 weeks earlier. I was still learning how my own body worked again. Still mapping the distance between a chair and a door. My father set down his fork at that. Ray Avery had a way of going quiet that was louder than shouting. 3 weeks out, and already with your hand open, he said. I told him my hand wasn't open. I told him I'd come home for Christmas. Not for money. And that, for the record, I'd been the one sending it. "That money's spent," he said, "on things that mattered." I asked what mattered more than the farm I'd been bleeding paychecks to save. He looked at me like I'd tracked mud across the carpet. "You come back broken. You come back broke, and you sit at my table acting like the world owes you a parade." Heather studied her wine. Mark stared at the tablecloth. My mother folded her napkin into a smaller and smaller square. I for one of them to say something. None of them did. "I gave you everything I made for a decade," I said, and my voice stayed level because the one thing the army taught me well was how to keep my voice level. That was when he said it, plain as passing the salt. "You're a burden. Get out of my house." I stood up. It took me longer than it used to, and I made them watch every second of it. I picked up my cane. I left the gifts on the table. At the door I turned back once, and not a single one of them met my eyes. The cold outside was the clean kind, the kind that scrubs the inside of your nose. I stood on the sidewalk and did the math, which is what I do instead of falling apart. I had $61 in checking, a service record, and a body that needed 8 kinds of follow-up. The savings I should have had, the cushioned 10 years of paychecks should have built, simply did not exist. I had given it away one wire transfer at a time, believing every word my father said about the farm. There was exactly one place left that had ever felt like ground under me, my grandfather's. I caught the late bus out of the downtown station, the regional line that loops south through the valley toward the small towns nobody's heard of. 60-some miles of dark fields and Christmas lights strung on barns. I pressed my forehead to the cold glass and let the engine noise sit on top of the other noise, the noise that lives behind my eyes since the pressure plate. The counselor at the VA called it hypervigilance. I called it the reason I sat where I could see the door. I hadn't spoken to Walt in years. My father had always relayed the news, always the middleman. Grandpa's slowing down. Grandpa needs the money. Grandpa's having a hard winter. I believed that, too. I was riding 2 hours through the dark to help an old man hold onto a failing farm, the way I'd been helping him for a decade. I didn't know yet that I had it exactly backward. I didn't know the old man thought I'd forgotten he was alive. The bus let me off at a gas station 2 miles from the farm, and I walked the rest on a county road with no shoulder, my cane finding the frozen ruts. Walt's place sat at the end of a gravel drive, a low farmhouse with a sagging porch, and behind it the rows of white boxes I remembered from childhood, the hives. In December they sat silent and clustered, the bees balled up inside keeping their queen warm, but the smell was the thing that hit me first. Wood smoke and something sweeter underneath. Wax and old honey, the smell that had soaked into every board of that property for 50 years. It came back faster than the words for it. And then a sound I wasn't ready for, a low, even hum from the nearest box, the winter cluster vibrating to make heat. For one bad second my brain rewrote it. The hum became the ring in my ears after the blast, the long flat tone that meant something had gone wrong, and my hand was already up before I caught it. I stood in the dark breathing the smoke until the sound was just bees again. The porch light came on. The door opened. Walt Avery filled it, smaller than I remembered and grayer, in a flannel shirt and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He looked at me for a long moment, at the cane, at the leg, at the duffel. I braced for pity. I'd had a tank full of it, and I was done. What I got instead was confusion, the deep kind, the kind that means two people are looking at the same picture and seeing different things. "Sam," he said. "Girl, what in God's name are you doing way out here?" I told him the truth in the doorway, because I didn't have the strength to dress it up. "Dad threw me out. I've got nowhere else. I came to help with the farm." He stepped back to let me in, and the kitchen was warm and ordinary. A kettle on the stove, a crossword folded on the table. He set me in a chair and put coffee in front of me before he said anything at all. "Help with the farm," he repeated slowly, like the words were in a language he half knew. "Sam, the farm's not in trouble. Hasn't been in years." I said that couldn't be right. I said I'd been sending money home for it for 10 years. Every deployment, money Dad said went straight to Walt for the mortgage and the equipment and the bad seasons. The old man's face did something I'll never forget. It went pale, then very still. "What money?" he said. It wasn't a question. "Sam, I never got a cent. Not one. I haven't taken a dime off this family in my life." The kitchen tilted. I gripped the edge of the table the way you grip a rail on a moving deck. I told him there had to be a mistake, a transfer that got rerouted, something. He shook his head slow. "Your daddy told me you'd gone no contact. Said the army changed you. Said you didn't write, didn't call, didn't want any part of us out here." He took off the reading glasses and rubbed his eyes. "He said it plain every time I asked after you. She stopped writing. She didn't want us." I had written him birthday cards from 3 continents. I had sent photographs. I had called a number that I now understood had never once been his. Somewhere between me and this kitchen, 10 years of my life had been intercepted and spent, and the man I'd come to rescue had spent those same 10 years believing I'd left him to grow old alone. He put me in my father's old bedroom, which was its own small cruelty, and I lay awake in it doing inventory. The house was proof against my father's story in every direction I looked. The roof was sound. The truck in the barn ran. There was a chest freezer full of game, and a pantry that could survive a siege. Walt owed nothing to anyone, ran 30-some hives, sold honey at 2 markets and to a co-op in town, and lived small and square and solvent. There had never been a foreclosure. There had never been a bad winter that money couldn't reach, because the money had never reached him at all. I want to be clear that I wasn't lying there crying. I was lying there recalculating, which for me is the same nervous system doing a more useful job. The bad night still came, and that was a bad night. The ceiling fan turning into rotor blades if I watched it too long. But under the noise was a question colder than the room. If I wasn't the daughter who'd saved the family farm, who was I? For 10 years, my whole sense of myself had been built on one load-bearing wall. I provided. I sent the money. I was the strong one. The one who didn't need anything because she was too busy being needed. Take that away, and I didn't know what was left. I had given a family that discarded me everything I'd earned, and I'd done it gladly because being useful was the only way I knew how to be loved. I lay in my father's childhood bed and understood that I was going to have to learn an entirely different thing. I just didn't have a name for it yet. In the morning, he didn't ask how I'd slept, which I appreciated. He made eggs and set a mug in front of me and looked out the window at the white boxes glazed with frost. "You can stay," he said, "not as charity. I'm 78, and my hands shake some mornings. I could use a second set." I told him I didn't know the first thing about bees. "Nobody does until they do," he said. "Slow learners make the best beekeepers. You can't rush a hive." I asked him why he was offering after 10 years of thinking I'd abandoned him. He turned the mug a quarter turn on the table, an old man's habit. "Because you got off a bus in the cold and knocked on my door," he said. "That's more than your father's done in 6 years. Then he said the thing I'd carry the rest of my life. Said it without any weight on it, like it was just a fact about weather. "Blood's just an accident, Sam. Family's the people who answer when you call." Outside, somewhere in the valley, a tractor coughed to life. He mentioned almost in passing that my brother Mark still came out to help sometimes on weekends when Ray didn't know. The two of us had that in common then. The kept quiet children. I told him I'd stay through the winter. I meant it as a stopgap, a place to heal and plan my exit. I didn't know I was agreeing to the thing that would put me back together board by board, sting by sting, the way you rebuild anything that's been blown apart from the ground up. The first bad one hit about a week in. A delivery truck backfired on the county road at 4 o'clock in the morning, and I came up out of sleep already on the floor, already low, already certain, my heart going like a fist on a door.
I didn't make a sound. You learn not to.
I just sat against the bed frame with my hands over the back of my neck until the dark stopped having edges. Walt found me there at dawn. He didn't kneel down and tell me it was okay, because it wasn't, and we both knew it. He didn't ask me to talk about it. He said, "Put your boots on. The bees don't care what kind of night you had." I followed him out into the gray cold, and he handed me the smoker, this dented tin thing with a little bellows, and showed me how to light the burlap inside until it breathed pale smoke.
"Slow," he kept saying.
"They read you. You come at them jumpy, they get jumpy." We didn't open the hives, not in that cold. We just stood among them while the smoke curled up between us, and he had me lay my bare palm flat against the side of a box. Through the wood I could feel it, the hum. 40,000 bees holding the dark together with nothing but the heat of their own bodies. I'd spent a week hearing that sound as the blast. Standing there with my hand on the wood, I heard it for the first time as the opposite of the blast. Something alive, organized, surviving the winter on purpose. My breathing came down to meet it. Walt watched me out of the corner of his eye and said nothing, which was exactly the right thing. And that was the first morning in 3 years I felt like I had somewhere to put my hands. Winter loosened into a wet Oregon, and the hives woke up. There's a thing that happens to a beekeeper that nobody tells you about, which is that you cannot do the work afraid. A hive can smell adrenaline. Come at them with shaking hands and a jittering heart, and they'll meet you sting for sting. 50 of them lifting off the frame, at once to tell you what they think of your mood. Walt taught me to slow my hands until they stopped being mine, and became just tools, to breathe out long before I lifted a lid, to let the smoke do the talking. "You're carrying all that war into the yard," he told me one afternoon, watching me fumble a frame.
"They feel it. Set it down at the gate."
It sounds like a greeting card. It was the hardest physical discipline I'd ever learned, harder than basic because there was nobody to yell me through it. Just me and the hum, and 1,000 small chances to panic. But here's the part that surprised me. The same trick that calmed the bees calmed me. I'd kneel at an open hive with my heart trying to climb my throat, and I'd breathe it down on purpose, the way Walt showed me, and the bees would settle. And watching them settle, I'd settle, too. The VA had spent 3 years teaching me to manage the noise with worksheets. The bees taught me to manage it with my hands. By April, I could work a full inspection without gloves, reading the frames like pages. Brood here, honey there. The queen moving fat and slow across the comb laying the future. I wasn't fixed.
I want to be honest about that.
The bad nights still came, but I'd found the one place in my life where staying calm wasn't a performance.
It was the whole job.
Mark started showing up most Saturdays. The first time, he stood at the edge of the bee yard with his hands in his pockets like a kid waiting to be led into a pool, and he said he was sorry about Christmas, and I told him to grab a hive tool instead of an apology. We worked in silence a while. My brother is gentle in a way that didn't survive well in our house, where gentle got you noticed and notice got you a target on your back. He'd kept his head down for 28 years and called it peace. Over a few weekends, in pieces, the family came out of him. Heather's new build-out past the country club for bedrooms, the quartz, the farmhouse sink. The wedding 2 years back that had run to the moon, the destination, the band, Dad's truck, Dad's boat, the second mortgage that had somehow turned into no mortgage at all. I listened and did the arithmetic I'm always doing, and the numbers started landing on top of each other in a way I didn't like. Where did it all come from? I asked him, casual, scraping wax off a frame. Mark shrugged. Dad always said he had a good year. Every year was a good year, the way he told it. He didn't know. Why would he? He'd been a teenager wiring nothing into nothing while I was overseas wiring everything into a black hole. I didn't say any of it out loud yet. I had a suspicion shaped like a wrecking ball, and I wasn't going to swing it on a Saturday afternoon with my little brother holding a frame of bees between us. But that night I sat at Walt's kitchen table and started writing down dates and dollar amounts from memory, building the thing I'd spent 10 years trained to build, a case. I lost a hive in late spring, and it taught me something I'd been resisting all winter. It was a colony I'd babied, a weak package that had limped through March, and I'd checked it too often, fed it too much, hovered over it like it was the only box in the yard. One warm morning I lifted the lid and found it robbed out, the comb torn, a carpet of dead bees on the bottom board, a few stragglers crawling in confused circles. A stronger hive had smelled weakness and stripped it clean in a single day. The silence where the hum should have been was its own kind of grief. I stood there ready to take it as a verdict on me, because that's my reflex, to turn every loss into a referendum on whether I did enough. Walt came over and looked in, and didn't say anything soft. You loved it to death, Sam.
He said.
You can't carry a hive. You tend it, and some of them die anyway. I told him I should have caught it sooner. Maybe.
He said.
Or maybe it was never going to make it, and the rest of the yard is thriving while you stand here staring at the one that didn't. He had me scrape the dead box, sterilize the frames, and set them out clean for a new package in July. Then he made me walk the rows and count the living colonies out loud. 29. I'd been so fixed on the one I couldn't save that I'd stopped seeing the 29 that were fine. I think you can guess why that lesson didn't stay in the bee yard. The phone started ringing in May. My mother first. In that bright, careful voice she used for company.
How was I?
Was I eating? Was Grandpa being a pain? When was I coming back to civilization? Not one word about Christmas. Not one word about the leg. Or the burden. Or the door. Then Ray.
Twice.
Leaving voicemails that started warm and curdled by the end. Your grandfather's getting on. Somebody responsible ought to be looking at his affairs. That word, affairs, sat in my ear like a splinter. I'd heard my father be warm before. He was only ever warm when he wanted something. And the wanting was always dressed as concern. I didn't call back. I'd learned that much from the bees. That you don't have to react to every movement in the air. Walt watched me, let the phone buzz out on the table one evening, and said,
He's circling something.
I asked what. The old man looked older than usual in the lamplight. He's been after me 2 years to sign the place over to him. For estate planning, he says. So it's clean when I'm gone. He said the word clean the way Ray had said affairs. I keep telling him no. He doesn't take to no. I asked why Ray wanted a bee farm he'd spent his whole life sneering at. He doesn't want a bee farm, Walt said. He wants 40 acres on a county road 40 minutes from Salem. There's a developer been sniffing the whole road. Ray smells money. I went to bed that night with a new line in my notebook. And a new question I couldn't answer yet. Why did my father need me gone? Specifically, to get his hands on this land. I asked Walt out one night whether he had anything in writing about the land, and the question seemed to remind him of something he'd half forgotten. He went into the back bedroom and came out with a folder, soft and brown at the corners, and laid it on the kitchen table under the lamp. The first thing he showed me stopped my breath. Letters. My father's handwriting. Years of it. 1 or 2 a year. Each one reporting on the family's contributions to Dad's care, listing amounts, listing my name. Ray had been writing to Walt the entire time, telling the old man that he, Ray, was generously supporting him, sometimes crediting the grandkids, never once telling him the money was mine, and never once sending him $1 of it. He'd been laundering credit through his own father, building a paper picture of himself as the dutiful son. Under the letters was a stack of my own envelopes, the cards and photographs I'd mailed Walt over 10 years, returned to sender in my father's hand, marked refused. Every one of them unopened. The old man had never seen them. Ray had collected them like evidence and sent them back, so Walt would believe the lie. She stopped writing. She didn't want us.
There it was.
The lie made of my own unopened mail. And then, at the bottom, the thing that changed the shape of everything. A document on heavy paper. The language of it dense and legal, dated 9 years back. An irrevocable trust. Walt had put the land and the apiary into it the same year my father first started pushing him to sell, naming himself trustee and me co-trustee, with a clause that the property could not be sold, transferred, or developed without the signature of every serving trustee, which meant me. I did it quiet, Walt said. I'd seen what Ray was. Figured the one person who'd never let this place get paved was the one already giving up everything she had for it. I sat there with 9 years of stolen letters in my lap and understood, finally, why my father needed me erased. As long as I was estranged and silent, he could argue I'd abandon the family and pry that trust apart. He hadn't thrown me out in anger. He'd thrown me out as a move. That night I finished the case I'd been building in my notebook, and the bottom line came to $191,000, give or take, across 10 years and 4 deployments. I could account for nearly all of it. Heather's wedding, the part that ran past $40,000, the down payment on the 4-bedroom, the vanishing second mortgage on the house in Salem, the one my father had paid off in a single year he called a good year. My money. Every dollar of it spent making my father and my sister comfortable while I learned to walk on a road outside Kandahar. I sat with that number for a long time waiting to feel rage, because rage would have been simpler. What I felt instead was the cold, clean focus I used to feel before a route clearance, the focus that comes when the situation is finally honest. Here is what I decided at that kitchen table, and it matters, so I'll say it plain. I was not going to chase the money. It was gone, tangled up in a joint account and 2 real estate deals, and a statute of limitations that no longer cared. Chasing it would mean years in a courtroom feeding lawyers to claw back dollars that no longer existed. My father wanted me reactive, loud, litigious, the unstable daughter he could point to. So, I'd be the opposite. I would not raise my voice once. I would build something real with my hands on the land the trust had already given me the standing to protect, and I would let the truth sit in the open where everyone could see it. He'd come at me with lies and a slammed door. I'd answer with a working farm and a stack of paper that didn't argue. You don't want to fight like that by swinging. You win it by being undeniable. I told them my decision at the kitchen table, the 2 of them and me, the same table where Walt had put coffee in front of me on the worst night of my life. I laid out the whole case first, the $191,000, the wedding, the house, the letters, all of it, because they deserved to hear it from me and not from a courtroom. Mark went white and quiet. Walt just nodded, slow, like a man having something confirmed that he'd suspected for years. Then I told them what I wasn't going to do. I wasn't going to sue for the money. It was gone, dissolved into real estate and a joint account, and a clock that had already run out. And chasing it would mean 2 years of my life feeding lawyers to claw back dollars that no longer existed in any form I could reach. More than that, it was exactly what my father wanted. He needed me loud and litigious, the unstable veteran daughter losing her mind over money, so he could point and say, "See? So, we don't give him that,"
I said.
"We don't chase what's gone. We build what's here." Mark asked what that meant for him. I told him it meant a job, if he wanted one, building something with his own name on it instead of hiding from a man who scared him. He said he'd quit the parts store Monday. Walt laid his shaking hand flat on the table between us, and Mark put his on top, and I put mine on top of theirs, and nobody said anything corny about it. We just sat there a second, three people who'd chosen each other, and then we got back to work. That, I understand now, was the moment I stopped being a soldier and started being an Avery on my own terms. I know what you're thinking because I've thought it about other people. 10 years. How does anybody send money into a hole for 10 years and not check the bottom? So, let me tell you what I actually did. Because I wasn't a fool. I was a soldier 8,000 miles from a bank. Around year 4, I got a bad feeling and asked my father for statements. He sent me 3 pages, screenshots, really, balances, and a couple of transfers, and a photo of Walt's barn with a new section of roof.
See?
Your money at work. The roof was real. It just wasn't new, and it wasn't mine. Around year 6, I tried to get into the online banking myself from a base computer and couldn't. He'd set the login up under his own email and phone number. So, every verification code went to him, not to me. The paper statements went to the house in Salem, to an address that wasn't mine. And when I called the bank from a satellite phone to ask about routing my pay into a separate account I controlled, I was told that splitting or closing a joint account couldn't be done remotely. That both holders had to walk into a branch together with photo identification. I was in a combat zone. He was in Salem. The nearest branch was a 9-hour flight in a war away. I did the thing you're supposed to do. I asked. I checked. I pushed. And every door that should have let me verify the truth had a lock on it that only my father held the key to. That's the part that should scare you if you've got family and a shared account and a long way to go. It isn't trust that gets you. It's the architecture. I trusted him. Yes. But I also tried to catch him, and the system was built, so I couldn't. Put yourself on that satellite phone, and tell me you'd have done better. By high summer, we had more honey than 2 farmers' markets could move, and I did what I'm built to do with a surplus. I made a plan. We pulled our first big extraction in July, and I'll never forget the first jar off the line. The comb crushed and strained, the gold of it holding the light like something melted out of a church window. Walt's hands shook too much for fine work by then, so he sat at the table and wrote the label himself, slow and careful in pencil for me to trace over later. 2 words in an old man's wobbling hand, Ruth's field. Ruth was my grandmother, gone 11 years, and that field of clover had been hers before it was anyone's. I held that first jar of Ruth's field and felt something I hadn't felt since before the blast, which was pride that didn't depend on anybody's permission. We set up an LLC, the 3 of us, me and Walt and Mark, who quit his miserable job at a parts store and moved his stuff into the spare room without once asking Ray. I found a regional program that helps veterans get into agriculture, and a mentor named Dale Renner, a Vietnam vet with 60 hives of his own, who walked me through wholesale licensing and food-grade rules and the unglamorous spine of a real business. The county grocery co-op took our first pallet on consignment and called 2 weeks later asking for 3 more. I want to stop here and ask you something because we're at the part of the story where it turns. If somebody in your life only ever calls you when they need something and never once when you do, you already understand the math I had to learn the hard way. There's no shame in having loved the wrong people loudly. The shame would be in doing it twice. Subscribe if you've been there, because what my father did next you need to see. Our first real market day was a Saturday in town, a folding table under a blue pop-up tent, 2 cases of Ruth's field stacked in a gold pyramid, and me terrified in a way no firefight had ever managed. I'm fine in a crisis. It's the small ordinary exposures that get me. A stranger's eyes, a question I can't control the answer to. Mark ran the front of the table because Mark, it turns out, can talk to anyone once he's out from under our father's shadow. He told the story to every customer, the bees, the farm, his sister the vet. Watching him, I realized the gentle thing in him that our house had treated like a defect was the most valuable asset we owned. We sold out by 1 o'clock. A woman came back twice, once to buy a jar, and once an hour later to tell me her husband had been in the Gulf and never talked about it. She was going to set our honey on the table and just leave it there, she said, as a way of saying something she didn't have words for. She didn't make a speech of it. She bought 3 jars and squeezed my hand. I stood behind that little folding table with the empty cases at my feet and felt the thing I'd chased through 10 years of paychecks and never once caught. I felt useful to people who had no claim on me, no blood, no history, nothing owed. Just strangers choosing a jar with my grandmother's name on it. On the drive back to the farm, Mark was still grinning. And I caught myself grinning too. And neither of us said a word the whole way because some good things you just let sit. Ray drove out to the farm in August, the first time he'd set foot on his father's land in years, and he came in smiling, which was how I knew it was bad. He stood in the bee yard in his good shoes, surveying the boxes and the new extraction shed, and the magnetic sign on Mark's truck that read Ruth's Field Apiary. And you could watch him recalculating the same nervous habit I'd inherited and put to better use. Well, look at this, he said, playing farmer. He'd come, he said, because he was worried about Grandpa. Worried about an old man out here alone making decisions. Worried about the burden of the land on Walt's shoulders. There was that word again. Burden. The word he reached for whenever he wanted to repackage his own greed as concern. He suggested, gently, reasonably, that the smart thing, the loving thing, would be for Walt to let Ray take the property into his name now. For tax reasons, for estate reasons. So, nobody got hurt later. He spoke past me the entire time, to Walt, as if I were a hired hand who'd wandered into a family meeting. I let him. I'd learned that from the hive. You don't react to every movement in the air. Walt said no, the way he always said no. Flat and final. And I watched my father's smile thin out at the edges. You're letting her poison you against your own son, Ray said, jerking his chin at me without looking. She abandoned this family for 10 years. Now she shows up broken and crippled, and suddenly she's got opinions about my inheritance. My inheritance. There it was, finally, the true noun under all the worried ones. He left without staying for coffee. From the porch, I watched his car kick gravel down the long drive, and I knew, the way you know weather is coming, that he'd be back. And that next time he wouldn't bother smiling. Mark filled in the rest over the next week, scared and quiet, the way he got when our father's name came up. Ray was underwater. The boat, the trucks, a stretch of bad bets on rental properties, a lifestyle floated on my paychecks that had stopped arriving the day I got hurt. The developer working the county road had made an offer on the whole stretch, and Walt's 40 acres sat right in the middle of it, the keystone parcel, worth more than the rest combined. If Ray could get the land, he could sell it and surface. If he couldn't, he was going to drown in front of the whole town. And the only thing standing between my father and that money was a 9-year-old trust with my name in it. So, he'd started building his case the way I'd built mine, except his was made of lies. He'd been telling people around Salem that his combat-injured daughter had come home unstable, that she'd isolated his elderly father out on a farm, that she was exerting undue influence on a vulnerable old man to steal his estate. He was setting the table to challenge the trust in court, to argue that Walt wasn't competent and that I'd manipulated him, and to paint me, the daughter who'd funded his entire comfortable life, as a predator. It was almost elegant. Turn the victim into the villain before the victim knows there's a trial. I understood then that he hadn't thrown me out at Christmas in a fit of temper. He'd been clearing the board. An estranged, absent daughter is easy to write out of a story. He just hadn't counted on me getting off that bus. He hadn't counted on Walt opening the door. And he had no idea that the abandoned daughter he planned to paint as unstable had spent 10 years learning to stay calm under fire. Here's where another version of me, the younger one, would have called my father and screamed the house down. I didn't. I made appointments instead. Through the Veterans Legal Aid Clinic, I found an estate attorney named Pruitt, a careful woman who read the trust twice, and then looked at me over her glasses and said the 4 most beautiful words in the English language. This is airtight. Structurally. Irrevocable meant exactly that. Walt couldn't be talked into undoing it, couldn't be pressured into selling, couldn't sign the land away in a weak moment because he'd already given up that power 9 years ago on purpose. Walt was the trustee while he lived, and he'd named me co-trustee with a clause that the property couldn't be sold, transferred, or developed without the signature of every serving trustee. That meant nothing happened to this land without my hand on the pen, and I was not going to sign. But Pruitt warned me about the soft spot. The one move left to Ray was to claim Walt had been incompetent when he made the trust or was incompetent now, and that I'd unduly influenced him. So we closed that door, too. We had Walt evaluated by his own physician and a geriatric specialist, both of whom documented, in clinical language I made sure was hedged and honest, that he showed no cognitive impairment consistent with diminished capacity. We had the original attorney who drafted the trust write a letter confirming Walt had come to him alone 9 years ago, clear-eyed and unaccompanied. I built a wall of plain, boring, verifiable fact around an old man and 40 acres of clover. No theatrics, no recordings made in secret, no traps, just documents that said what was true and would keep saying it in a courtroom under oath long after anyone's voice gave out. My father's whole strategy ran on the story being murky. I spent that month making it clear. When he came back, and I knew he would, the murk would be gone, and so would his only weapon. Heather came in September, which surprised me because Heather did not do gravel roads. She picked her way across the yard in white sneakers, wrinkling her nose at the bees, and found me at the extraction shed in a stained apron, sticky to the elbows. She'd come, she said, to make peace, family to family. Then she spent 10 minutes explaining why the peace required me to stop being difficult about Grandpa's estate. Dad's in a hard spot, she said. And honestly, Sam, after everything the family's done for you, you could stand to be a little less selfish. Everything the family had done for me. I set down the frame I was holding and asked her, evenly, what exactly the family had done. She listed it without a flicker. They'd taken me in for Christmas. They'd never made a big deal about my, situation. And the money over the years, well, family money was family money. It all came out in the wash, didn't it? And it wasn't like I'd had a wedding or a house to spend it on anyway. There it was in the open. The assumption I'd been suspecting for months. She genuinely believed my money had been her money. She'd grown up being told I was the strong one who didn't need things, and she'd built a whole comfortable life on top of that lie without ever once questioning the foundation. I could have handed her the notebook. I could have shown her the number, the wedding, the down payment. Watched it land. I didn't. Some part of me understood. She was as much a product of our father as a partner to him. I just told her the estate wasn't a topic. The door was always open if she came as a sister, and walked her back to her car. She left confused. People always do when you refuse to give them the fight they came for. In October, the co-op offered us a real contract. A year of guaranteed shelf space across 6 stores. Our biggest order yet. And a buyer named Linda, who wanted to do a proper signing out at the farm because she liked the story and thought her customers would, too. The county paper wanted to run a feature. Veteran-run apiary. Local honey. The works. A photographer. An afternoon, the whole community invited to see the operation. We set it for a Saturday at the end of harvest, the busiest the farm had looked in a decade. Hives heavy, shed humming, jars of Ruth's Field stacked gold on every surface. I'd come to that gravel road 11 months earlier with $61 in a duffel, and now I had a business, a brother, a grandfather, and a reason to get up that didn't involve outrunning anything. I want to pause the story here for 1 second because we're almost at the part you've been waiting for, and I don't want you to miss it. My father once stood up at his own table and told a room full of relatives that I was a burden. In about a week, a different room was going to hear a different account, and not from me shouting it, from the paperwork, from the witnesses, from the honey on the shelf. If you've ever been written off by the people who owed you the most, you know exactly why I waited, why I built the case slow instead of fast, why I never once called him to scream. Loud feels good for a night. Undeniable lasts. Hit subscribe and stay right here because the Saturday of that signing my father drove out to the farm one last time and he had absolutely no idea what he was walking into. Saturday came in clear and gold, the kind of October light that makes even a working farm look like a calendar. By 11 o'clock, the yard was full. Linda from the co-op had set up a folding table near the extraction shed for the contract. The photographer from the paper drifted around shooting the hives. Dale Renner had come out with 3 other vets from the agriculture program, and a dozen neighbors stood around with paper cups of coffee, and Walt sat in a lawn chair in the middle of it all like a king at the center of a court he never wanted, pleased and embarrassed in equal measure. Mark worked the crowd in a clean shirt, actually grinning, a thing I hadn't seen my brother do since we were kids. I was at the table with Linda, pen in hand, about to sign the biggest order of my life, when I heard tires on the gravel coming too fast. Ray's car. He got out without closing the door, and he came across that yard like a man crossing a parking lot to a fight, and the smile was gone, just like I'd known it would be. He'd heard about the signing. Of course he had in a town that size. He'd come, I understood at once, because in his mind, this was the moment he was losing the land for good, the asset that was going to save him, hardening into something the whole county now thought belonged to his crippled daughter. He didn't see a celebration. He saw a robbery in progress. He didn't lower his voice for the crowd. He'd never once in his life considered that an audience might not be on his side. "I'm sorry, folks," he announced to the yard, loud, performing, "but somebody needs to know what's really going on out here." The neighbors went quiet. The photographer slowly lowered his camera. Linda looked at me, and I set the pen down on the contract, calm as a Sunday, and turned to face my father across 40 acres of clover and witnesses, and I felt the old steadiness come down over me like a hand. Slow hands, low voice, work the hive. What came out of him then was the speech he'd been rehearsing around Salem for months, and he aimed it at the crowd, not at me, because men like my father always play to the room. "My daughter," he said, "came home from the service unwell. Came home with problems," he said, and tapped his own temple so the neighbors would understand what kind. She'd moved in on a confused old man, isolated him from his own family, turned him against his only son, and was right now in the middle of stealing an estate out from under everyone. He had documents coming, he said, lawyers. This wasn't over. He told that yard full of strangers that I was unstable, that I was a manipulator, that I was, and he reached for the old reliable word one more time, a burden this family had carried long enough. I stood and let him finish. That's the part one want you to understand, because it's the whole story in one motion. I did not raise my voice. I did not step toward him. 12 months earlier his words had sent me out a door into the cold, and now they just moved through the air around me and kept going because I'd learned the one thing he never had. Bees can smell fear, and they answer it with fury, and the only way to walk into a swarm and come out whole is to make your heart go quiet on purpose. I'd been practicing that every single morning in this yard. My father was the swarm now. All noise and venom. Certain that loud was the same as right. And I just stood in it, breathing out long and slow the way Walt taught me, my hands open and still at my sides, and I waited for him to run out of air. The neighbors had gone dead silent. Somewhere behind me a hive hummed its low, even note, the sound that had once been the blast in my head and was now just the farm breathing. When he finally stopped, chest heaving, waiting for me to scream back, so he could point at me and say, see, what did I tell you? I didn't give him the satisfaction. I gave him something worse. I gave him the truth. Quietly. With paper. You're right that there are documents, I said. Let's let everyone see them. I walked into the shed and brought out the folder, and I laid it on the contract table next to the pen, and I narrated it for the yard in the flat voice I use when the situation is finally honest. This is an irrevocable trust dated 9 years ago, I said, drawn up by Grandpa alone, naming me to keep this a working farm. Here's the attorney's letter confirming he came in clear-eyed and unaccompanied. Here are 2 physicians' evaluations finding no impairment. I set each page down like a card. The land cannot be sold. It was never going to be sold. Then I picked up the second stack, and these, I said, are my father's letters to my grandfather, 10 years of them taking credit for supporting this farm. And these are the cards and photos I mailed home from overseas, returned unopened in his handwriting, so Grandpa would believe I'd abandoned him. I let that sit one beat. "The money my father told you, I never sent," I said. "The burden he says I've been came to $191,000 over 10 years and 4 deployments. It paid for my sister's wedding. It paid off this man's house. I funded the comfortable life he's standing here defending." I turned to him then, and for the first and only time I spoke directly to my father, and I kept my voice exactly as low as it had been. "You stood at your table last Christmas and called me a burden," I said. "I was the one carrying all of you." Walt rose out of his lawn chair slow and shaking and said to the whole yard in his cracked old voice, "Every word she said is true, and I've got the papers in the house to prove the rest." Ray's face went through everything at once, the fury, the calculation, the search for an exit. He did not apologize. Men like him don't, not when they're cornered, only when it's useful, and it wasn't useful anymore. He called Walt a senile old fool. He called me a liar. He looked around the yard for one face that believed him and didn't find a single one. I didn't gloat. There's no juice in it. And the bees had cured me of needing it. I just picked up a jar of Ruth's Field from the stack on the table, the gold of it catching that October light. And I walked it over and set it on the fence rail beside my father. "Gentle, the way you set down anything you don't want to break. Take it," I said. "It's the only thing from this farm you're ever going to get." Then I told him the rest. Quiet. Final. For him alone. "The gate stays open if you ever want to come back as a father. But the land isn't yours. And neither am I." He looked at the jar. He looked at me. For 1 second something moved behind his eyes that might in a better man have become shame. Then he turned and walked back to his car. And he left the jar sitting on the rail. And he drove down that long gravel drive for the last time. I watched the dust settle. Then I went back to the table,
Picked up the pen, and signed.
The co-op contract went through that afternoon. And Ruth's Field went onto 6 store shelves by Thanksgiving and sold through twice. The lawsuit my father threatened never came, because Pruitt sent his attorney the same wall of paper I'd shown the yard. And there's no case to be made when every fact is already standing in daylight. Mark stayed. He runs the wholesale side now, and laughs more than he sleeps. And the gentleness that got him nothing in our father's house turns out to be exactly what bees and customers both respond to. Walt made it through the next summer well enough to sit in his lawn chair and watch us pull the biggest harvest the farm had ever seen. I got one letter that winter from my mother. Carol's careful handwriting on good stationery. 3 pages that circled and never quite landed on the word sorry. She wrote that things had gotten complicated, that your father isn't all bad, that she'd always known I was the strong one who could handle being on my own. I read it twice at the kitchen table, where Walt had once put a coffee in front of me and changed my life. I felt the old pull, the trained reflex to fix it, to answer, to be useful to her one more time. Then I folded the letter back into its envelope and put it in a drawer. I didn't write back. Not out of cruelty, out of arithmetic. She called me strong my whole life as a way of explaining why I'd get nothing, and I finally understood that you can love someone and still decline to keep paying for the privilege. The drawer was answer enough. I think about what Walt told me that first morning more than almost anything else in my life because it turned out to be the only family law that ever mattered. Blood made the Averys my relatives, but a stubborn old beekeeper who opened his door in the cold and a brother who finally stopped being afraid are what made me a family, and they were waiting at the end of a bus ride the whole time. That's my story. 10 years of paychecks, 1 cold bus ride, and a jar of honey worth more than every dollar I lost.